presentation is an odd presentation, and I want to start out by saying that. The first presentation I gave was to this chapter, and it was about the Battle of Chestnut Neck. And the problem I had researching that is all the speeches from the state of New Jersey from when the DAR monument was put together, and all 30 of the pension applications from 1832, which were first-person handwritten accounts of what happened. And the British records, Navy and Army, were quite different than the story the state of New Jersey spoke at the dedication of the monument. And it was very clear that the inlet that we know today as Little Egg Harbor Inlet was not in the same place. Not many of you were here in the chapter at that point, but I got immediate flack from a guy who was a really academic heavyweight. He's no longer a member of the chapter, but he worked me over and claimed that what could a theologian know? What could an ancient language professor know? And I didn't like that. And so I spent the next year obsessing on it. I mentioned it in the same presentation 2 years later at Stockton at their Pinelands course. And I was asked a question. I don't remember who asked me the question, by the way. It was somebody from their marine biology department. And they said, could you explain why the inlets moved? And very foolishly, I said, of course. And then when I got home, Rob, I realized that I had no idea what I was talking about. And so for the next 6 months, I spent time at Stockton's library and at Rutgers Library and at Princeton Library studying what's called beach morphology. Morphology means the study of the shape of things. And beach morphology just asks, how do beaches form? How do they change? And why do inlets move like they're on a conveyor belt? And so that was the genesis of this presentation. What you see up there that says Colonel Richard Summers SAR chapter and today's date, and when it was originally done, said Stockton University, Pinelands short course, and whatever that date was that I don't even remember. Because as I've continued to look at it, the only thing that has changed, which I will mention later on, is I think I now understand why certain streets on Absecon Island, and maybe Brigantine, and probably Hex Beach, Ocean City, flood, and why others don't. Even though when you do the LiDAR elevation ratings, sometimes the streets that flood is even a little higher than the street that doesn't flood. And that doesn't make sense, does it? But it does. And we'll see that. So with that, let me begin, and I'm going to move as quickly as I can so I don't anesthetize you. This is the first truly detailed map of New Jersey. It was done by a Mr. Gordon, so it's called the Gordon map. The date is 1833. And what you are looking at is you are looking at Little Egg Harbor Inlet. This is the north end of Brigantine, also known as Little Beach. This does not exist anymore as a separate island. This was called Tucker Beach. There was actually a hotel on that and a lighthouse. And this is the southern end of Long Beach Island. This is Great Bay, as you can see from the words. I want you to look at the yellow star. Do you see that? It's on top of 5 or 6 little islands. They look like finger islands, don't they? They are. And they are created behind almost every moderate-sized inlet that exists. They are created by the flood tide water coming in at high tide, dumping sand, and then going out and not taking 100% of it out. Same thing happens, by the way, on the ebb tide out in the ocean. And that's how we get shoals. But we get rid of them. Now I want you to look at one other thing. I want you to see a green star. There's no islands there on this map. I'm going to show you that there are islands there. Whoever drew this map, just for whatever reason, neglected it. But now look at the blue star. Tell me what you see behind the blue star there that looks like this. Can you see those finger islands? Now what that tells you is there was once an inlet there. And by the way, that was called Old Brigantine Inlet, Tom's Inlet, etc. This leftover inlet is where the inlet was. It was called Old Inlet during the American Revolution when the British came in. They had to come in, put their ships right behind here, anchoring island. That now has moved back there with erosion. And they then rowed all the way back through Great Bay and the Mullica River. That's how they had to get there. Because Great Bay is just a big old flat bay. And when you go through it today and on the northern side of it you see the channel. That northern channel is not a natural phenomenon. That's an over the years dredged phenomena from the days of fishing and clamming so fishermen could get back there. And there's remnants of it there, but it was all flat. Now, what I want you to see is this map in 1833 looks like it does. In 1841, the U.S. Geological Survey, I guess it's called, did a very accurate map, totally by survey, and it's identical to this map except it included the finger islands here that would have been produced by this inlet. The argument that got me to do the presentation was this. The person said the inlet was always here. It's obvious. Well, it's not obvious. Because you can't come in here and turn downward and have a place to wreck more big ships. He said the ships that couldn't be there. I said that's where Foxborough is. That's where the Revolutionary War fort made of mud and logs was. Not a combat fort, but a spy fort to observe what was going on at the inlet. And the guy as much as told me I was crazy. Now I don't know about you, but sometimes when people irritate you enough, you go to work to prove something, even though you really don't want to do all the work, just because it's a matter of principle. And I will tell you, I enjoyed it thoroughly. A couple of years later, when I asked the person, I said, just say uncle and get it over with. And he said, uncle. The Revolutionary War soldiers knew where they fought. There exists a letter that was written here when the guy spotted the British coming in by the major, who rode all the way back to Chestnut Neck and then sounded the alarm. You know where it was. So now, what happens? Let's move ahead quickly now. Here's the 1845 map. Here's our blue star. Can't quite see that as well on this map. Here's the yellow star, the inlet now. You can see those islands. And oh my, here's that inlet that no longer exists. And look at this behind it. Now, by the way, I apologize to you that it's a little fuzzy. The projector I bought 2 years before I retired in 2010 because I preach via PowerPoint. I don't go to any church or any conference or any camp meeting to speak where I can't do a PowerPoint. Because I've learned that when people can see and hear, they retain a lot better. So that to me is much more important than theological tradition. Now your question would be, why did this is the question I want you to ask in your mind. How did the inlet get from here to here? Because what has to happen is this inlet has to open up and this inlet has to what? Close. Because you still only have a certain volume of water. Let's talk about it. It's because of the currents. Have you ever noticed when you're on the beach that the waves do not come straight in at you? They either come from that way or that way. Now, if you are in the summer, which most of us would be in the water at the beach in the summer, very few of us would not want to do the winter. If I am on the beach, let me turn around, and I'm looking out at the ocean, the current or waves are coming from that way, south. They're hitting the shore and bouncing off at an equal angle to the north. That's just simple geometry. In the winter, however, when the currents are much stronger, they flip. And the current that we get from Nova Scotia and that area of Canada is much stronger, and it comes flushing down, and it bounces from the north to the south. Now, when that bounces off the beach, it picks up sand. Are we okay with that? And then it carries it. But it can only carry it so far because sand granules have weight. And the more the weight is, the quicker they will fall off and hit the bottom. So this just shows you the idea of the longshore currents, either in summer or north, and this just shows you, showing this angle as theta, that the angle will always be equal. Now, I'm not sure I know the science behind that, but it's just what they said. Now look at this. This is a cutaway of an inlet. The longshore current is this way. It's coming from the north, and what it will always do is it will start to drop sand, and that will cause the island end to curve inward and the island to elongate. Are we okay with that? But what it will do on the other side of the inlet is the opposite. It will act like a big push bar, and it will flatten it out and it will push it back, and whatever is behind here, over the decades, it will begin to compress and close, and so inlets will disappear. Now, if an inlet opens over here, we're going to talk about how it would inlet. And then we have the total amount of water. This inlet is not going to take in enough water in and out to keep it open. And the water that coming from here, the sand coming from here, is going to close it. It's that simple. And if you get that picture, the rest makes sense. Now, this down here just shows you what it would look like in a cutaway if you were underwater, that the sand would be dropping here, and it would be building up there. Now, are we okay so far? Okay. Now your next question is, how do we get a new inlet? I see how you close an inlet, but how do you get one open? Now, I'm sorry this is not clearer. This comes from an early 1900s transcript of a lawsuit, for those of you who have been or are lawyers, where the county of Burlington tried to take away Brigantine from the county of Atlantic because they claimed, based on an old property line, that it was originally theirs. They lost the lawsuit, by the way. But in the lawsuit, the state had to go back, the lawyers went back and looked at every U.S. Geological Survey report, and they knew where the lines were, where the islands increased and where they decreased. And by doing that, they were able to understand how an inlet forms. On an island, the barrier island, if it's natural, you always have a long set of sand dunes, a foredune. By the way, for those of you who were raised in Absecon Island, the first sand dune started at Vermont Avenue in the inlet and went all the way to Jackson Avenue and was 30 to 50 feet high. You say, I don't believe that. Come to the Atlantic County Historical Society and I will show you photographs. Covered with trees, freshwater springs popping up. But what happens is, long term, the beach in front of it starts to erode. And eventually, the sand dune will start to weaken in its foundation. When you start to get storms, moderate storms, it will start eroding the foundation, if you want to call it that, of the sand dune in the weakest spots. And you'll have a localized breaching. Watch. The sand dunes will go like this, and Okay, we have a valley. That's a vulnerable area. Now what happens is you get the bad storm. Sandy, for example, Superstorm Sandy. And what it does is it takes these little breaches and it blows them out. But that's not what the creation of the inlet is, the little inlet. That's just a little baby inlet. What's happening is when all that water goes back into Great Bay, and then all the way up the Mullica River, for example, and spreads out in the watershed, and my niece lives on an island at Sweetwater, and her island is about 2 feet off the water's edge, but yet her island was covered with 5 feet of water during Sandy. Now that means that that storm filled up this valley back there, up to where it would be 5 feet at the water, at the island. That's an incredible amount of water. I tried to calculate it when I gave this presentation the first time, and a physics professor at Stockton went ballistic because I didn't do the physics exactly right. And I had to tell him, you don't interrupt speakers in class when they're giving a thing. And he went, well, I do. I said, you don't when I'm speaking. And he decided he would not pick that fight. Now what happens is Superstorm Sandy passes and it heads over to Philadelphia, right? What's gravity going to do with all that water as the tide goes out? And there, the force of that is the cause of an inlet. You say, but Norm, there was one inlet, there's a new inlet here, there's an old one here. But this inlet's taking all the water energy. And this inlet doesn't have enough energy left to stay open, and so it closes. In 1778, when Chestnut Neck happened, the northernmost inlet, at what we call Holgate today, was open and it was big. Maybe as much as half a mile across. And there was no inlet other than some marsh patches where it is now. But in 1795 and again in the early 1800s, 2 storms completely flipped it. So now that we understand that, here is the watershed, what it looks like to the Mullica River. You can see this light green. That whole river going up in here, up to about here, the water was 5 feet higher than it normally would be at high tide. And that water would spread all the way out into here. And now when that went out, you kind of have a mini Niagara Falls going through, cutting away the sand, cutting away the marsh. But the marsh is all full of weeds and roots. And the marsh is kind of impervious to all this. The water just gets over it, and it goes down, and the marsh looks the same. And it waves to the water and says, bye, come visit me again sometime. But where it's just sand, everything has changed. Here's another look at it. When the water comes in an inlet, it builds those islands I talked about behind the inlet. When the water goes out of the inlet, it builds them in the ocean. They are called shoals, and that's why the early inlets had so many shoals, because they didn't have dredges to take them away. Today, like I think it was about 2 years ago or 3 years ago, they dredged Little Leg Inlet. They're going to have to do it again maybe 15 or 20 years from now, because the same thing will happen. 2017 NOAA map. Here are the islands. Here's the inlet today. Here's our little islands that we're expecting that show it's an inlet, correct? Can you see them? Over here are the islands really bluntly shown where the old inlet was. But if you look very carefully in here and at all the maps, you find that this area used to have all those islands. But the water coming against it during the winter has compressed it. This was called Tom's Inlet, or Old Brigantine Inlet, but there was still another Brigantine Inlet. Here's the earliest map I could find, 1795. The names of the maps are the people that drew the maps, okay? Yeah, and this shows Little Egg Harbor Inlet here in 1795, but it doesn't show Old Inlet, which would have been right up about here. It shows Brigantine. Say, oh my goodness, what is this here? Oh, there were 2 inlets in Atlantic City in 1795. Yes, one was called Comfort Inlet. I guess that's because it was easy to get in. The other was called Quarters Inlet, and the island between them was called Peter's Beach. No longer there, is it, for all of us Atlantic City folks? Islands change. Here is that map I showed you again from 33. Shows the old inlet at here, shows the new inlet, and this shows there was an old Brigantine Inlet here, and here are these islands shown clearly that were formed by the tide going out. Now we're pretty much getting past this. I remind you that my white stripes are the islands they forgot to draw in on the map that the U.S. government map to do show. Here is the U.S. government map. You can see it again. Same thing, the 2 inlets. So are we okay with that? We have 2 inlets that became 1 inlet. But it didn't stay closed. A storm came along in 1929, and guess what it did? It opened the old inlet at Holgate. And for a couple years, the folks on Long Beach Island that had anything down here were stranded because this was a pretty wide inlet. And then in a few years it started to close. And my understanding, Mike, is that they have placed boulders in the ground under there to make sure that that can't happen again.
I don't remember that, but there was probably 30, 35 years ago. There was a Beach Haven Inlet, there was a shoal in the middle, which is Old Tucker's Island, and to the south was what we call Little Egg Inlet.
That's right.
We called the Northland Beach.
So you
Haven
remember
Inlet.
it?
Oh yeah, and the water used to race through there like the Colorado River on the tide.
Just interesting that it's, and by the way, that could open again next month.
Matter of fact, Norm, I remember striper fishing there, anchoring right off of Beach Haven Inlet when my death flyer was over 200 foot of water.
I can remember,
Because the scouring was so
I can
bad.
remember going out in the old inlet, and I was behind a 30-footer, and on the swells, I could just see the captain's galley. And then it closed, later.
By the way, you're now talking about New Jersey inlets and what they look like. These guys aren't that old. Well, at least. In 1812, you have new inlets open. You have this inlet's open again. By the way, the old inlet is much bigger than the new inlet. Here you have Brigantine Inlet, also fondly called Wreck Inlet. Does that give you an idea of what you might not want to go, where you might not want to go with your boat?
I have gone out Wreck Inlet.
Okay, well I have not had the courage. But then you get down here and you have Absecon Inlet, and Absecon Inlet has an entirely different shape. And you get down here to Great Egg Harbor Inlet, that's between Longport and Ocean City, and look what's sitting out in the middle of it. An island that, by the way, was sometimes as large as 1.5 miles wide. That was called Sand Island. And by the way, before 1900, Ocean City Gardens did not exist.
Water.
It was water.
Yeah.
And the state gave people the right to claim it, and it was sold to dredging companies in some very curious land deals. And in fact, the name that kept coming up in the land deals, what was that guy that owned? Kirkman, yeah, that owned that title company. His name, anytime there's something funny, his name is always in it. I did title searches for a lawsuit once.
Unchanging Land Company.
Yeah, I guess that is. I don't know anything about them.
Oh, yeah?
Here is another version, by the way, of the map I showed you before, but looking at a bigger thing. And here you can see Atlantic City Inlet. Here, it doesn't even show the Brigantine Inlets in there. Down here, there's no island there. This is 1833 and forward. So the islands are constantly changing is what I want to say to you. Here again, by the way, is this is New Inlet here. This is where Old Inlet would be. And this inlet is now about twice the size of what's there today. And look at the shoals here. It's a shame you can't see it. I wish the projector were newer with a better bulb. You could see the shoals actually form the same form as the islands behind. So it really is a very predictable piece of science. Now we go to 1839. Great Egg Harbor is the same. Huh, what did we just get here? Oh my goodness. There's another inlet between Longport and the north end of Atlantic City.
Is that Jackson Avenue?
Yes! That's how they made the divisions between the cities on the island, Mike. There were inlets there. Now this inlet had a creative name because it only had water in it at low tide. So they called it Dry Inlet. You're saying, how did you find out about that? In 1992, my then 70-year-old mother was struggling taking care of her 92-year-old mother. And they asked me to, Marilyn and I, to help. We ended up closing up our house, having our stuff moved over to Atlantic City, lived there for 3 years until she died. One day, now my grandmother's mind for the present was not so good the last year. She raised me, by the way. And so she knew exactly who I was. But the last year, she couldn't get my name down. But all she knew is I somehow was her grandson and I was a minister. So her name for me was Mr. Minister. So one day she came in and the office, which was the old sporting goods store, for those of you that shopped at Beasley's Sporting Goods, my office was there, and she said, Mr. Minister, can I tell you something? And I said, yeah, Grandma, what is it? And she said, do you know beach plums make delicious pies? And I said to her, what's a beach plum, Grandma? She said, you pick them off bushes on the beach. I said, did you ever do that? She goes, oh yeah. And listen what comes out of her mouth. She said, the last time I did it, I was 8 years old. My stepfather, her stepfather was the county detective, who was based in Atlantic City, and he was going to Longport on the train to investigate a burglary. And so he decided to take her with him. And she made this statement, which changed my view of the island. I said, Grandma, what do you remember about the train ride? Because her old memory was incredibly accurate. She said the most exciting thing was the first time I ever remember going over a bridge in a train, and we went over 2 bridges to get to Longport. Well, let me tell you something. How many of you know anything about Obscene Island? In colloquial English, there ain't no bridges on Atlantic Avenue between the inlet and Longport. It was then. And that was what started me looking for them. And I found out this map that actually showed it. And the bay, by the way, that goes down to Dorset Avenue and then shoots out the mile stretch, there was no mile stretch. That's an artificial waterway done in the 1920s to sell land. The bay went all the way down to Longport, and there were inlets at Fredericksburg Avenue and at Osborne Avenue in Margate. And the old deeds and old maps showed them. And that's why Osborne Island, that's why Osborne, let's go on a rapid trip. Why do some streets flood? Well, remember the picture of the inlet like this? Now I want you to picture you have an inlet there, and there's water in it. That water acts as weight, and it compresses the bottom of the inlet. And eventually, with all its vegetable matter, if you will, creates peat, and it essentially seals the bottom of the inlet. So what you have is you have something like a gutter, if you will. Now along comes good old Atlantic City entrepreneurs before the DEP existed. You fill them, of course. You don't want to build bridges. Fill them up and just pave it. So they all got filled up and paved. But the problem is, they put essentially loose sand
In a bowl.
in a bowl.
Yep.
And the bottom was already hard, but the top was still not as hard, so it's permeable by water. So Mike, the tide comes up, storm tide, and where does the water go? The easiest place it can go. So it just slides right through the sand, and the street that's there now, the water doesn't pay attention to the streets. When I lived in Atlantic City and there was a hurricane or a nor'easter, you knew where the waters came from? Came right up out of the sewers.
Yeah.
Because the sewers emptied in the bays.
You're right.
And you just watch the sewer on the corner and you go, uh-oh, we're going to be stranded. But of course, if you were me, raised in a sporting goods store family where your boat in the backyard turned over in the winter, just got the boat up, put the oars in it, turned it over, and pushed it out the gate and rode up and down the street. But anyway, you see that. I'm going to move quickly now. This is the best map of our area if you're interested in how things change. This is the 1885 Cook's map. If you Google 1885 Cook's map, you will come up with two maps. One will not have these little red lines on it and this yellow. You don't want that one. You want this one. Because this is so accurate, it even shows the heights of the dunes. And this map starts with the portion I'm showing you now, and it starts here in Atlantic City, comes down here. Here's where Dry Inlet was. Now it's amazing. They didn't bother to show it on this map, but it was still there because Grandma remembers it in 1908. So, but it may have opened and closed itself. Down here we found evidence on the old surveys of another map at Fredericksburg Avenue. You say, well, that's the borderline between Ventnor and Margate. What better way to buy a piece of land? I'll buy the land from that inlet to that inlet. You have markers. You never thought that those inlets were going to move. Better than a tree that could fall down. And then we found this other inlet at Osborne Avenue. That survey, by the way, goes all the way back to the early 1700s. I believe it was 1715. But remember, that shape in the sand underneath the sand is still there. And then here's the strange thing. Everybody here think of Longport? There's a bridge that goes to Summers Point, right? Yeah. At one time, the island ended right at the bridge. And at that time, I'm not talking about those 10 or 12 streets that disappeared in the early 1900s. They were added on. And then the ocean decided, well, they're ours, it's ours, so we're going to take it back. But we found that on a map as well. And the bay went from here all the way up to where it is now. So waterways change. Now, let me make one over. Yes?
Did the inlets at Osborne and Fredericksburg go all the way to the bay?
We know, okay, the answer is all the way to what would have been called the bay then. You know what the bay is, what we know as the bay, which is actually the inland waterway or inland thoroughfare. That kept on going past Dorset Avenue all the way to Longport. There was no mile stretch. Now, beach thoroughfare that went around Atlantic City Baderfield Airport went all the way around and finally came out near Margate Ridgely's Channel. That was another way you could go. But that was it. Now, what I was going to say. Maybe it'll come back. Okay. This I just happened, by the way, this is a scan of a survey that was done in the 1860s, I believe it was. They went up to Woodbury and they surveyed every deed back to the 1695 originals. And they marked where the different boundaries were. It's of Ventnor and Longport only. By the way, you can see these strips. You can see how lots were sold. They were to the water line from the beach all the way to beach thoroughfare. So that means you owned whatever inland waterway was there too. But down here in the notes is where we find about Osborne Avenue, where we find about the length of Longport, and where we get Fredericksburg Avenue Inlet confirmed. Now, Egg Harbor, big watershed there. Egg Harbor Inlet has not changed as much, with the exception, let me just figure this out. Okay, Longport, Ocean City. So it's Longport, Ocean City from your view, correct? Longport is shrunk down to only to the Longport Bridge. Ocean City has no gardens. It ends at North Street. You say, well, that's a good reason to name the street North Street, because it's the most northern street. What is the new thing about a lot of government people now, the phrase they're using? Common sense. It's there. And what's in the middle? An island that's 1.5 miles long. Only name I've ever seen for it is Sand Island, and you're going to see that here. Here is the Longport Bridge. Here is Longport ending. Here is Sand Island. Can you see what the tides are doing to it, what the currents are doing? And here is Ocean City with North Street right about there. And so the same thing that's happening in these other, that happened up at Little Egg Harbor, is happening everywhere along the line. These currents and storms are opening and closing. Now, today, a little harder to do that because we've built jetties. What we've done is we've hardened the walls. But yet we have caused either beach erosion or massive beaches to occur in different places. My understanding in Wildwood, you almost have to get a taxi cab to get from the boardwalk to the surf. Where in Margate and Ventnor, it's right there. So that's kind of where that was. And we're almost at the end now. And this is a blow-up of the map that I showed you before. And this thoroughfare here is the thoroughfare going through. And it shows you how detailed they were. By the way, in 1900, there was really not much in Ventnor. And there was a little bit in Margate. But the homes that were really down beach were in Longport. And it built little by little before the Depression, but not hugely. But when the Depression was over, it went phew. And then when the Second World War was over, it just blew the socks off of it. And that's exactly what happened with Brigantine as well. There was no Brigantine Bridge until 1925. And this is a map. I'm not going to go through it with you. I just want to show you. And here is Longport today, this line, if you can see it. Here's Longport at its greatest length here. Here is the Longport Bridge, and here's where Longport ended in the late 1800s. Over here, here is what's left of that island. It's kind of filled in and been moved to Ocean City. And then because all those shoals are under the water, what do the people do in the early 1900s with the riparian right? They just, whoever owned the land, I happen to have been in a lawsuit with the grandchildren of the original owner. And they wanted to go back and prove that a very wealthy title company owner was building docks where he had no riparian rights. And we were able, with all the, I went down to Cape May. I spent 2.5 months going to Cape May clerk's office every day, searching titles. You say you're not a title clerk. That's why I was hired. Because I was trained to look at old documents. But when you get trained to read old documents, you don't take anything for granted. You move very slowly. And the client was dying. But because I said, I'll work for you, that was $50 an hour. It's no big deal, but it was a challenge. And I said, but you also have to pay me my drive time. I said, everything. And they went, what? I said, I don't have to do it. Oh, do. By the way, I learned something for all of you. And by the way, I have a couple of attorneys in the room. Title researchers at county clerk's offices are incredibly inept. Incredibly. I said to them, you just stopped at 1960 in the title search. Yeah, we just assume everything's accurate before that. Well, guess what? We proved that there were no riparian rights transferred with the land. This guy had no rights, and he has to pay off for an attorney that ever wants to spend the money. I think I still have all the PDFs. Yeah, about 20 to 25% of Ocean City gardens on the bay, including the lagoon, have no consistent riparian rights, Mike, going from the beginning riparian rights to the present. And they all have built docks. Somebody could make a chunk of money in there. Because this guy with the title company was only happy to pay up for several $100,000 and a whole mess of attorney's fees, including my spring gift. So with that, here is a map from 1812 that shows the island in the middle of the Great Egg Harbor, Hip Harbor. And it shows Atlantic City Strange, it shows Brigantine Inlet, and it shows both inlets up there. So these inlets are all real. We know why they moved. That is just showing you that flood tide deltas and ebb tide deltas are there, and that's how you can tell where an inlet is. Go to what's called LIDAR, L-I-D-A-R. Google New Jersey LIDAR or South Jersey LIDAR. You'll get to a map, and it will be, LIDAR does not see houses, streets, or anything like that. It only sees ground. Doesn't see trees, doesn't see grass. It sees ground. And you can see exactly where it is. By the way, if any of you ever came to those presentations I gave on the mills, on some of the creeks in Atlantic County, how we found the dam locations, we're finding the straight line where the dam was built across the mound, because nature doesn't make straight lines. Bang, there's a dam there. You are done.